All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's a minute past the hour here, so I'm happy to see many attendees here today, and thank you again for joining American Bird Conservancy in our second of 3 webinars in this dynamic forest series. I will go ahead and give a quick intro before we turn it over to our 2 presenters for today. And my name is Linnea Rouse. I am the Great Lakes Private Lands Director for American Bird Conservancy, located in Wisconsin in our Great Lakes region. Our focus is on Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So today's webinar is about dynamic forests for birds and wildlife in the Great Lakes. And Pat, you can go ahead. Thank you. So just to give a very brief overview of American Bird Conservancy, American Bird Conservancy, or ABC for short, is an international nonprofit bird conservation organization dedicated to conserving wild birds and their habitats throughout the Americas. Our bird conservation strategic framework, which is summed up by this pyramid, shows how we approach bird conservation. And we emphasize achieving results on the ground and working in partnerships. In the Great Lakes region, our work largely focuses on finding and implementing solutions to bird population declines by working at landscape scale levels. We work across boundaries and form innovative partnerships to deliver habitat management and landowner incentives to achieve healthy, dynamic, sustainable forests at scale, which benefit both birds and a diverse array of wildlife. And our Great Lakes team of private lands foresters includes Jack Haben and Dwayne Fogard in Minnesota, myself and Pat Weber in Wisconsin, and Michael Paling in Michigan. We all work with private landowners to achieve bird habitat improvements on the ground across these 3 states. And as a reminder, this is one of 3 webinars in the series. Our 3rd and final webinar will be held on Thursday, March 30th, so in 2 weeks. And we will share information during that webinar on how private landowners can get involved in managing for bird and wildlife habitat on their land. We will have a panel of 3 Natural Resource Conservation Service district conservationists to help answer questions about the Regional Conservation Partnership Program and financial assistance and practices that are available for landowners. This last webinar is relevant not only for landowners, but also for natural resource professionals who work with landowners, such as foresters, soil conservationists, private lands biologists, and more. And I will share a link in the chat here in just a few minutes, both of the recording of our webinar from February 16th, but also a link to register for this 3rd webinar if you have not already. And with that, just a brief overview of tonight's agenda for this webinar. Tonight's 1-hour webinar will consist of 2 presentations discussing benefits of dynamic forests beyond just birds. First, we'll have Pat Weber, who is a wildlife habitat specialist with American Bird Conservancy, discuss the benefits of dynamic forests to a broad range of wildlife, focusing on the relationship between wildlife habitat and landscape disturbance. After Pat's presentation, Haley Frater with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources will talk about how dynamic forests and early successional habitat in particular can benefit both white-tailed deer and forest health, and provide some background on the Deer Management Assistance Program, or DMAP, which is administered by the Wisconsin DNR and provides both technical and financial assistance to interested landowners. After Haley's presentation, we'll open it up to all of our panelists and address any questions that you have entered into the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your screen. Our panelists will also try to answer your questions as you enter them during the presentation. So with that, thank you again for attending our webinar tonight, and I will hand it over to Pat.
All right, thanks, Linnea. Just quick sound check. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you loud and clear.
All right, great. Well, thanks again, everyone. And when I have about 20 minutes in this presentation tonight, rather than do a deep dive into other wildlife species that benefit from dynamic forests, kind of as the title states, What I'd like to do is spend most of my time talking about how dynamic forests have come to be, excuse me, how they're threatened and what can be done to ensure they survive now and thrive into the future. I think it's really important to understand how wildlife have adapted to their surroundings and how that plays into dynamic forests. To start though, I want to spend just a little time talking about what's not going well for a very large and important segment of our wildlife. So some of you might remember back in, I think it was 2019, Science Magazine published an article on the findings of researchers from 7 institutions, one of them being ABC, that approximately 3 billion breeding adult birds, or more than 1 out of every 4 birds, has been lost since 1970. Yeah, that's like 30% of the estimated total bird population. And probably most alarming was that it just wasn't the rare and endangered species, but included many of our common birds that we see, like juncos and red-winged blackbirds, meadowlarks, etc. Here in the Great Lakes, where we're focused on with this webinar, most of our forest birds, they're either going to fall into that northern boreal region or eastern forests, and both have been hit pretty hard. In particular, if you look at a couple of species, it's estimated we've lost about 90% of our evening grosbeaks. Now, this is a bird living here in Florence that I would see frequently, that I just rarely see. 60% of our wood thrushes. This is just a couple examples of birds here in the Northwoods, but unfortunately, there are a lot more facing that similar fate. So what's driving this decline? Well, what's going on? Well, I'm a Generation Xer, and I remember back in the 1992 presidential campaign, James Carville, he was a strategist for Bill Clinton, and he felt the campaign messaging to the people was way too washed with too many issues to be effective. So he pounded on the singular message of "it's the economy, stupid" as a campaign theme, believing that was what voters felt was most troubling to the country at the time. And it gave that campaign focus and clarity in achieving their goal and winning the election. So I kind of want to do the same tonight. I mean, if there's one theme that I'd like to leave you all with, is to stress the importance of habitat and the role that it plays, and not only ensuring keeping our birds from declining, but really all of our wildlife that we enjoy. And it's really digging down into the details of those habitat components that are essential. What do they look like, and how can we protect and create more of it? That's really, again, the theme that I'd like to get across. So what is essential bird and wildlife habitat, for that matter? So let's do a little bit of a deep dive into this particular area. There's essentially kind of 5 main components, if you will, of habitat that's critical, and kind of break it down into these areas, and we got a little acronym below. But obviously it starts with clean, available fresh water. Nothing survives more than a couple days without it. Food, viability of a food source. Haley's going to touch on that, which is obviously something that is driving whitetails both positive and negatively. But food sources in that habitat, and I want to stress viable food sources. Invasives are so detrimental for so many reasons, and one of them is that they provide a food source that in a lot of cases is not viable for our native wildlife species. Or throwing shelled corn out for deer in the wintertime as an example. They can't digest it, access the nutrients. So food viability is extremely important. Then we get into cover and shelter, and there are so many aspects to cover and shelter. It's really an important area. It's protection against weather, it's protection against predators, it provides protection for breeding species. It's physical cover in the way of vertical and horizontal woody stems, thermal habitat in the wintertime. It's provided by our conifers, south-facing slopes. It's downed woody debris for all of our our insects, our invertebrates, reptiles, tree snags for cavities, grasses, forbs for nesting material. And you can go on, and cover and shelter is extremely critical here in the Great Lakes. And space, space to loaf, space to breed. It's an important aspect. For example, ruffed grouse, you can provide, excellent habitat that can provide cover and feed, do all the things to what you would think would support a larger number of birds. But you get down to it, males on breeding season need a certain amount of space, and they'll ensure they have that space. So species need that space to loaf, to feel protected, to breed. It's a key component of our habitat. And then finally, it's arrangement of all of the above. Having all of those pieces together that provide that high quality habitat that's so critical for our wildlife species. As important is what happens with those habitat components when they're impacted by disturbance. And disturbance is, both as we'll find out, it's a good thing and it's a not good thing. And we'll kind of break down as to why that is. But disturbance is a reality, and there's a whole host of different disturbances that I've listed here. Of course, we think of things a lot of times like fire and wind and flooding and drought. Ironically, winter is a disturbance, temperature and sunlight, depending on the severity of the wintertime that we have. The amount of daylight can have a significant impact on our habitat. Infestation and disease and predation, obviously, are major disturbances. Talked a little bit about invasive species, but our toxins and our pesticides. Conversion, other land use, going from forest to agriculture, or forest to residential development. And then really the fragmentation of the arrangement. Again, up above in components, we talked about how critical arrangement is. But when you fragment that, like we have here with the subdivision down below, really the subdivision, could be in the forest that we saw above. Now that fragmentation has really impacted the arrangement, if you will, and made those individual pieces like cover and shelter and food and water not as effective at all for habitat. So habitat disturbance, mentioned that could be good or could be bad. So how do we break this down? Essentially, let's look at that disturbance as either adapted or not adapted. Disturbance is essentially a stress. We know that some stress is a good thing. We're all told exercise builds up our strength and resiliency, and some of that disturbance is good. But catastrophic stress can be destructive. Much of what we're seeing with our decline in bird populations has to do with these unadapted disturbances. I'm going to go ahead and just share a few examples of adapted disturbance versus non-adapted disturbance. The one that is, probably the most controversial and the one that we're all trying to figure out is climate change. Clearly, the climate has always been changing. Climate change has been a disturbance that has been adapted over time, but now we're faced with the potential of, a very severe change, a very fast change, something that has changed exponentially faster. And so where are we? Are we in a system that continues to have resistance and resiliency to adapt to that particular change, or are we going to exceed that and have the system crash? We talk about things like assisted migration. Do we know our native species? Do they have that resilience and resistance to handle that particular change, or do we need to start thinking about making sure the systems don't crash? That's a tough one. But you get a sense as to what some of those not adapted disturbances are. Things that happen relatively recently, very few occurrences, but they're usually severe. Things like fragmentation and land use change, those are unadapted disturbances. Deer seem to be doing a pretty good job in some cases, a pretty adaptive species, but unfortunately many of our other species, like our neotropical migratory songbirds, have not. And so we've got disturbances. I'll put a skyscraper with glass as a disturbance in their migratory path. They've not adapted to that. We lose a lot of birds that slam into glass during their nightly migration. So when you think of disturbance, think of those that are adapted, which lead to dynamic landscapes, which lead to healthy landscapes, and degraded landscapes, which do not. And there is a juxtaposition of habitat disturbance that we recognize. We know that suppressing adapted disturbance degrades the habitat. Again, we're told if you don't exercise, if you don't use it, you lose it, right? And there certainly is that element as we talk about, suppressing two of the major disturbances that we had here in the Great Lakes. And Dwayne Fogard, my colleague, touched on that really well in the first presentation, talking about the suppression of fire as a habitat disturbance and the suppression of beavers. We had hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of beavers, and they were very effective in flooding shrub wetlands, in resetting back alder and willow, and kind of going through that whole cycle. And so, two major disturbance regimes taken out of the system has provided us with some systems that are shade tolerant. For example, they don't have that reset, if you will. So we see systems like maple and beech and ironwood that are even aged and overly mature. On older, we see as a very shade tolerant, and it's not an invasive. We know it's clearly a native, but it's aggressive, and it's one, once they're shade tolerant, they can kind of perpetuate their own species. And so we see our more sun-loving species struggling: our oaks, our cherries, our birch, a lot of our native forbs, grasses within shrub wetlands also. And here's just a couple of pictures. This one on the left is actually, I've got a few acres of my 40-acre property here where we like to have just maples. Certainly good in the summertime for our red-eyed vireos and our scarlet tanagers, but very little habitat, especially in the wintertime. Same with our older swamps too. They tend to kind of perpetuate and shade out a lot of competing species. So what I'd like to share with you, again, knowing I've got a long clock, I'll make sure there's enough time for Haley, but I want to talk about our essential habitat elements of a dynamic forest. And really, for simplicity purposes, kind of want to split this into these three layers. And so we have our understory, which is very sun-loving, one very dependent on sunshine. Want to let the sunshine in. In many cases, we need that disturbance in order for that to happen. And this is our herbaceous layer. This is where many of our insects, our beneficial insects, are down there, and they're kind of that first line of species that's converting plant matter into protein. Extremely important, and they're in that herbaceous layer. Got our brambles and our brush, just providing cover. And again, if you go back to that habitat model of water, food, cover, and space, brambles and brush is very important in providing a lot of those. We got our young saplings and sprouts, and of course down below we've got our woody debris and leaf litter. And then we get into that mid-story layer, and this is where we have a lot of our shrubs that grow to a certain height, our hawthorns and our service berries, and our younger trees as well. Those trees that are kind of in that 15 to 30-year range, if you will, depending on the species. But an important layer, especially for nesting birds. Lastly, our overstory, our very mature trees, our hardwoods and our conifers. Those trees, in the way of providing mast for food and providing for our songbirds that take advantage of the overstory, and then providing obviously a lot of upright woody debris in the way of snakes. And so dynamic forest, we've got those three layers that are providing all different habitat services that we talked about to a wide range of wildlife. Just want to talk about a couple of species that take advantage of all three of those layers. And rough grouse, a very important species to us here at Great Lakes, need all three layers. You need that dense early successional habitat, or ESA, for their brood. They talked about the fact that the understory is an insect factory, and in young grouse, a lot of broods, but grouse in particular, need a high source of protein, high quality source of protein when they're very young. And so these areas are very important. It's also providing them the cover that they need, because they're attractive food sources for so many other wildlife species. And then you kind of get into that mid-level, and pole timber is, where you see a lot of the nesting. That's these kind of timber stands adjacent to these patch openings, if you will, where a lot of nesting takes place. And then right now, we're just coming off of winter here, and can't tell you every morning, the number of grouse that I see in not only aspen, but in the oaks here, and even the hop hornbeams getting their buds. So really important that we've got all three age classes to support the species. And it's the same for the golden warbler. You can almost lay this particular habitat, these same three layers. The golden wing warbler. Sometimes I think people hear about the program and they think they want to cut down the entire forest. And for golden warblers, and nothing can be further to the truth. In fact, you'll see at the end here, we probably, the two things we don't have enough of are young forest, which we have a program that, of course, we'll talk more about in the next one for funding, but we also don't have enough old growth. And I think that there's opportunities, obviously, to consider to continue to let certain areas continue to grow. We need all of those age classes. Golden wing warblers, they nest right on the ground or just above. They're crazy little birds, so they're right down low. They need that thick herbaceous kind of, not just like saplings, but also forbs and grasses, and they use it for their nest material. The males need you can see these trees here. They need them to attract the female. They are up there and they're flashing themselves and they're singing. So very critical component. And then most critically, once the brood is fledged, they need to get into a mature deciduous overstory, because they feed primarily on leaf roller caterpillars. So it's very important that we don't just have early successional without these other important components. That all of these layers that are really important. Okay, so I'm at 6:23. I'm going to walk through. I could probably spend an hour walking through all the different pieces of dynamic forest and what does wildlife need in the way, again, of water, food, cover, space. But I want to go through a couple here, and then I want to touch on just some key messages that I'd like to leave. And then we'll turn it over to Haley. So vertical structural diversity, we kind of talked about that in our previous examples. We refer to it kind of as that green wall. We've got multiple canopy layers that can be, done by creating gaps. It can be done in doing, large clear cuts with reserves, though, keeping back key trees, as an example, can be done in a lot of different ways. But you can see, and this was one of our sites where we've got, again, that layering of our grasses, our forbs, kind of in the upper right-hand corner. We've got some oaks in there, we've got some cherry back in there. We've got a system. And of course, here is, a mature maple system, very little in the way of mid and understory and the understory. Get to another area, species diversity. Non-native invasive plants. I'd love to spend time just talking about, the detriments of invasive species, not only from the perspective that some can just completely take over and be the monoculturing system, but the fact that they have not been an adapted disturbance means that they, that relationship between insects that want to feed on them and the ability of the plant to have protection hasn't evolved. And so what we find is, for a lot of our invasive species just don't support much of them. Insects don't really, they don't want much to do with them. And of course, there's things like, the berries of a buckthorn, of an invasive buckthorn that is not a diuretic, but it's a laxative, if you will, for birds. And so birds are feeding it, but they end up being dehydrated because it has laxative properties. Anyways, native species are so important just for the fact that it's an adapted disturbance. And then we, again, provides protection against when there are strong disturbances that come in. If we've got a diversity of species, we're kind of protecting ourselves, as you would if you're diversifying your investments, if you will, for example, in the stock market. Talked about in supporting large diversity food sources. Here we've got a species diverse system versus a red pine system, not far from me. The ravens like it this time of year, the woodpeckers, but that's about it. Large diameter trees, again, there's a need for kind of an old growth. In fact, this is a picture of our Dwayne Fogard. He probably doesn't know that I have him here, but I believe that's him. That large diameter trees are extremely important as we look at the habitat components, places for protection, cover, if you will. A lot of mass can come from some of the hardwood species as well. Softwood inclusion, so important here, especially in the Great Lakes and the Northwoods, that we have coniferous species, really for that thermal habitat. These two pictures are in my property. This is what I call a spruce island. So after I had a pretty aggressive cut of aspen here, I went in and planted about 15 spruce saplings tight together, and creates kind of these cluster islands, which are extremely valuable for, not only cover all year long, but in the wintertime, you get that dark foliage from the needles. And I mean, it's warmer in there just because of the absorption of sunlight, the blocking of wind. This little picture down here, a grouse had actually busted out of here. He was down below in here when I took the picture. So this is just one tree alone where a grouse was in kind of underneath and hiding. So it's got high value for us here in the wintertime. And again, thinking of habitat, wintertime is extremely important to take into consideration. Lastly, downed woody material. This actually is a picture of a small drop-down tornado in the Ottawa National Forest. This was a very dark forest until you got into this area where tornado dropped down, and it was amazing the species diversity in where this tornado had gone through. And it wasn't a very big one. It was maybe just a couple of acres, but not only is it leaving a lot of downed woody material, but it's providing for that sunlight for other species to grow. Okay, now my key takeaway messages. I'm at 6:28, so I'll make sure I leave Haley plenty of time. So if I could, have a couple of messages, it's diversify your forest in age and species. Again, this is not, habitat, isn't a nail and early successional habitat's a hammer. That's not the solution. It's having all three of those age classes to get the greatest amount of diversity. This is from Dr. Larkin, a quote of, having about 15 to 20% of our landscape in young forest, 0 to 15 years, 20 to 30% greater than 125 years. And then kind of that middle age, which really depends on the species of being 50 to 65. And then kind of maintain that, if you will, over a shifting mosaic over time. And that gets kind of into the dynamic forest block management methodology. It's really important that we start thinking about what are the keystone species. And this is Linnea will know his name. It's Doug. I forget his last name now, but he's a entomologist talking about his research with some species that, as you think in terms of the Pareto rule, that there are some that are just better. And some species provide a larger amount of quality wildlife habitat quality because, they support more insect life, they support more mast. This is just the case for oaks. Oaks are extremely valuable. We've seen cases where they've been high graded out of systems where they've all been taken, and you end up with non-desirables. So anything we can do to protect and propagate more oaks is a great message I'd like to leave. And again, don't ignore the importance of native insects as wildlife in your habitat. Again, it's the first line of species that converts plants into protein, and that protein is needed by some of our wildlife species as they start out as young. So insects are extremely important. They're not only pollinators, but they convert, they decompose, they create like 91,000 different species. And so again, think of that kind of that layering of the different levels of the forest in maximizing insect production. so important for us here in the north. You got to think in terms of what do we do to get our resident species through the winter time. I'd love to see, large, cedar swamps again. A large hemlock groves. It's hard to do, but those are systems that provide extremely critical thermal habitat. And so winter is extremely important to figure out how we can get our species through. And then lastly, just there are so many resources. We're trying to talk about some that are available. We'll talk more about it next week. But this is not an inclusive list of all the groups. There's so many more. But as a landowner, there are so many resources out there, and it can be intimidating. But there are groups that can kind of help you navigate some of that. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my desktop, and I am going to turn it over to Haley.
Awesome, thank you for that, Pat. And I think you did a really nice job providing a nice segue into what I'm going to talk about. You did a really kind of the high level picture. Now we're going to look at it a little bit from a single species perspective. Not to say that the stuff that I'm presenting in relation to deer doesn't also apply to other species, but we'll look at it specifically from a deer standpoint. So I'm going to share my screen and then I'll introduce myself. And okay, are you seeing, can somebody confirm that you're seeing my
Looks good, Haley.
I'm a little afraid it's not going to progress. Let me just make sure that I have it right on my screen, because okay, looks like it's going to progress, just not on my screen, which will be awesome, but we're going to make it work. So hello, I'm Haley Frater. I am with the Wisconsin DNR. So I am the DMAP, or the Deer Management Assistance Program, as well as our private lands coordinator for the Wisconsin DNR for our wildlife management programs. So I will start out talking a little bit about deer and young forest, and really more than that, like deer habitat as a whole, and then kind of wrap up a little bit with what DMAP is and what we offer, and who we are, in case you're interested. So I thought I'd start with something that I think probably most of you, if not all of you, have heard, the lovely saying that deer are an edge species, or deer love edge, right? All of these things that we hear in relation to deer and how much they need and use edge. Well, I have to admit, to me, let's see if you're going to work. It's not exactly the case. Deer, there's nothing, especially about the edge itself, that deer are really attracted to or really need. And yes, we have study after study that says high edge, that's where deer are. We have higher deer populations in high edge areas. There's studies that show we have higher rates of fawn survival when we have lots of edge, but it's not the edge itself that they're actually attracted to. What deer really need and really want is exactly what Pat was talking about. It's a habitat matrix. And I laugh, Pat, at some of your photos that you showed, because even though I took this photo, it's a very similar photo to some that you were showing. What white-tailed deer need is a mosaic of different cover types. They need that young forest. They need middle-aged forest, and they need old growth forest. These are all characteristics that they need for different parts of their life cycle, as well as for different seasons of the year. And they tend to like them, and here's where that edge piece comes in. They tend to like them in relatively small, highly interspersed mosaics. And so they tend to have areas with lots of edge because we have this intermixing of, let's say, a young growth next to a conifer, an older conifer stand. But it's really that mixing of the conifer stand and that young growth stand that is what they're attracted to and needing. So we'll dive into this a little bit more. Okay, so why do deer need this habitat mosaic? Why do they need this kind of interspersion, intermixing of these different habitat types? There's three major reasons, and I'm kind of simplifying this, but three major reasons. And one is, first, their habitat changes throughout the year. What they need in summer is different than what they need in winter. Their diet changes, the cover types that they need change. These all vary across seasons. And in fact, deer are and can be migratory species. And so that's where we see some of these changes throughout the year. Another piece is that they use different cover types for different reasons. They use young growth largely for forage, right? Well, like I said, conifer stands, they're using those largely for thermal cover, right? So they're using these different stands for different types of reasons. And a third is we're talking about a prey species. And as a prey species, we also need to think about escape cover and hiding from predators. And so that comes into play as well in how they use these different habitat types or different cover types, excuse me. All right, so let's look at this from a year-round perspective. What do deer need? And two of the major types of cover that they need on an annual or year-round basis are escape cover and bedding cover. And what that actually looks like for a deer, if we're looking at escape cover, what they're using escape cover for is really to evade predators. This is their let's get out of the way, let's not get eaten by XYZ predator. Ideal escape cover tends to be really thick young forest, right? They want to have the ability to be invisible and get away from those predators. So it can be, like I said, thick young forest, it can be shrubs or brushy habitat. Tall grass prairie can actually be really good cover, especially some of those warm season grasses can provide some nice dense cover that will allow a deer to escape. Like I said previously, these small patches for escape cover, they like to have these in about 5 to 10 acre patches that are no more than a quarter mile apart. So a lot of that high interspersion again. And then for bedding cover, this is used not only for resting, but also ruminating. So giving their stomachs time to digest the food that they've eaten. For this, they like vegetation that's about 5 to 7 feet tall. They want to be able to cover their bodies while still being able to see in order to avoid those predators. And they want it in an area where they can get to escape cover really easily. So that if a predator does come while they're bedding down, that they have that path to get out. So thick young forest, again, here can come into play, as well as shrubs and bushy habitat and tall grass prairie. So some of those kind of similar characteristics or similar cover types can come into play. They also, again, like these to be small and really interspersed patches. So they want these especially near foraging areas. And I'll talk about foraging in just a little bit. And again, like I said, really close to that escape cover. All right, so forage, let's look at their forage kind of throughout the year because it does change across time. And this is kind of a nice graphic from NDA. So what used to be QDMA, Quality Deer Management Association, kind of looking at how the deer diet changes throughout the year. So in spring, this is the one time of year where grass can come into play. And this tends to be our cool season grasses. This is the stuff that we can get often referred to, we're looking at our spring green up. This can come really into play as that snow is melting and we're looking for that new green vegetation to provide that energy that they need right away when their bodies are really weak. For the most part, grasses aren't going to be an ideal forage, but in this time of year, it's the one thing that may be out there that they can eat on, which is why you can see it only takes about 10%. It's a very small percentage of their diet overall. Then in summer, we see them eating more and more of their forbs. And forbs, this can be anything from things like asters and trilliums. Trilliums are a really common one. Blue bead lilies, ragweeds. These are all really common forbs that they're going to eat in the summer while they're available. Then in fall, as we hit that time of year where they're trying to build up those reserves for winter, this is where they're hitting their acorns. You can actually see this big bump in their mast intake or switch to mast intake. And that's really referring more than anything to their acorn mast or that hard mast, where white oak is the preferred species just from a digestibility or partly from a digestibility standpoint. And then in winter, this is where we have the browse, woody vegetation that they are eating. This can be things like oaks and white pines and maples and white cedar is the candy to deer, right? But in winter, that woody browse becomes really important. And for the most part, what we're looking at when we say browse is stuff that's available under 5 feet in height. Not all browse is created equal. So that fresh tips on trees is some of the most nutritious, as are stump sprouts. So if you get a stump and you have a bunch of shoots coming out, they actually have higher nutritional value than a single stump coming out of the soil. And so taking those things can come into play when we're looking at winter. And then there's some seasonal changes in cover that also come into play. One of them being fawning cover. So in spring, this is used as a way to hide fawns. So fawns themselves don't have any scent. So if we can keep them hidden, that's a big key here. And one of the big differences in fawning cover compared to some of the other covers that we've talked about is not only do we want that vegetation low to conceal the fawns, but we also want overhead cover. So they say about 50% overstory cover. It's really important, especially when we have really young fawns. But again, some of this dense, low cover with some aerial protection. This is a little bit shorter vegetation, more in the 2 to 6 foot. Again, this can be grasses, it can be kind of some dense shrubs or young seedling sort of vegetation. We do want these in really small areas, and they tend to like them adjacent to foraging areas, or more ideally, patches within foraging areas. So again, these are fairly small, 2 to 5 acres, and really highly interspersed, like I said, with that forage and water and cover, makes it a lot more desirable. And then thermal cover, and Pat hit on this a little bit. Thermal cover, this is where our conifers are, right? And this is used in Wisconsin. Thermal cover is primarily used for winter to maintaining that body temperature. That's not always the case in the South. We do have a lot more cases where they are using thermal cover from a cooling standpoint rather than a heating standpoint. But again, what they want here is a conifer where they're getting that snow can stay up above, so you get that canopy closure. And then low understory so that you have easier movement. You're not having a bunch of branches and things in their way. They also tend to occur in lower areas where you have really good wind protection. And a big key here, again, is adjacent to forage patches. So there's been a lot of studies, especially in the north, where the distance a deer has to travel to get to a forage patch in winter really changes throughout the year. And so in the beginning of winter, they may travel a little bit farther to go get higher quality food. But as winter progresses, especially this time of year when you have really deep snow, like I know we do in the north right now, this is a time of year when they won't travel nearly as far. They're going to go to what is the most convenient or adjacent patch to forage in, even though it may not be the best quality food. So having that forage and thermal cover really close together, adjacent, can really be helpful for deer, especially this time of year when their bodies are their weakest. Okay, so I wanted to kind of take a little bit different from what Pat was talking about and look at these different stages of forest, kind of as a forest moves across time and how that relates to what it provides to white-tailed deer. So looking at young forests, this is really a time of forage. So there's actually been several studies that say right after a timber harvest, you're increasing the woody, or you're increasing the forage to deer by 5 to 10 times. And having, again, that forage that's less than 5 feet tall, this is a really great time for highly nutritious food for deer. And that can be especially helped by combining timber harvest with prescribed burning. Having that light penetration that we receive in these young forests can also provide those forbs that are really important in early spring as well as summer. And then as you get this dense regeneration, this again is a really great time for some cover for deer. As we get into the mid-story, here we're starting to lose some of those vegetation browse standpoints, but as especially shrubs, this is a time where we can start to have more soft mass that's available for deer. And some hazelnuts, things like that. But that mid-story is really important from an escape cover and fawning cover perspective. And then as I mentioned, as we get into that late, from a cover standpoint, again, this is where we have thermal cover. For that later successional, we need that for that thermal cover. But those are also the trees that are going to be mature enough and producing hard mast. So we've all heard about how deer antlers senesce, they get smaller after they peak, right? So as they start to get older, we actually see some declining in there. Oak trees aren't like that. Oak trees continue to produce those acorns, and we don't actually see that decline. So having that hard mast production from a later stage forest, mature forest, is really important from a fall health standpoint. Okay, so I kind of touched on young forest throughout, but I wanted to drive it home just a little bit as to why young forest and it's important. I just mentioned this, but it provides a huge flush of forage and really nutritious forage. In fact, the most nutritious forage for white-tailed deer in relation to browse. Like I said, those terminal buds are some of them are most nutritious. So those ends, those very tips, are more nutritious than the stems themselves. So having that available to them, and like I also said, having those stump sprouts available. It also provides forage when deer are in most need. And what I mean by that is in winter, right? Having these timber harvests in this young forest provides that winter forage that deer need to survive and make it through the winter. That is when most deer die. That is when starvation is highest. That's also when predation rates are highest, partly from having to move to get that forage. And this early spring is one of those times, especially. So having this young forage can play a really pivotal role to kind of counter or combat that spring die-off. And then I also just kind of wanted to point out, this is kind of intuitive, but I think sometimes it's just good to say it, is that having young forest is that essential starting point to having that mid and later successional forest on the landscape too. And I have heard similar studies to, like Pat pointed out, about having 10 to 20% of your landscape always in young forest, and doing that kind of on a rotation and maintaining that. Not only does that provide the forage that deer need, but it also provides enough young forest on the landscape to ensure that you get proper tree regeneration, even in times of high deer numbers. And that's some work that's come out of Pennsylvania. And so just a couple of quick considerations when looking at how do you optimize young forest for white-tailed deer. And so from a harvest characteristic standpoint, again, we want relatively small patches and maintaining those across time, or maintaining that proportion of land in that young forest. Another really important piece, and this ties back into that escape cover as well as sometimes fawning cover as well, is having some fingers or peninsulas, as you can kind of see. I hope you can see my cursor, like this, kind of sticking into those harvests. And then maintaining individual trees or clumps as well in there. This can be really important in early spring when we're having, can put a fawn kind of in that clump for protection, and the mom can be out foraging. And then another really great aspect that you can do with these is, once you've gone in and done your timber harvest, is seeding those logging trails afterwards with some native vegetation, some native plants to provide those forbs and grasses that can be important. And then from a landscape standpoint, it's not only thinking about escape cover, but thinking about escape routes. How are you putting those on the landscape in relation to these young forest patches? And then keeping these young forest patches next to thermal cover, right? So have those conifer stands next to, or your young forest next to conifer stands. And then just thinking holistically about what other forage availability is on the landscape and how does that play into what a deer is going to do. And I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to do this really quickly, just a brief overview of DMAP. So we are a resource that is here to help you, to help implement deer management on your property. And we're doing so to really meet what your goals are. So the program was started in 2014. And like I said, the main goal of the program is to provide site-specific land and herd management. And so our goal isn't to manage for any specific reason for ourselves, but is to work with the landowner to meet their goals and what they're trying to do with the property, whether that's increase your deer numbers or decrease your deer numbers, right? So we're here to work with you and what your goals are for the property. One of the big things that we do is provide education and outreach opportunities. And another point I wanted to point out with the program is that we are open to everybody, regardless of property ownership or hunting status. So to be honest, you could have an acre of property or 2,000 acres and enroll in DMAP. We have no limits and no maximums in those regards. And although we do talk about hunting and hunting as a tool, we aren't only for hunters, so open to everybody. We have three main pieces to the program: stewardship, outreach, and management. From a stewardship perspective, we try to promote and encourage sound land stewardship practices on both public and private properties. I mentioned outreach. We do provide outreach and educational opportunities, both information on white-tailed deer, but also other wildlife species as well, as it aligns with landowner goals. And then management. Like I said, we do site-specific management geared around what the landowner is looking to receive. Our program works a little bit different than a lot of the other programs. We provide the benefits that you receive for the program depend on how much land you enroll. So if you have 0 acres, it's a free program. You can come attend any of our workshops, receive our monthly newsletter, have access to our database, which is full of resources at no cost. Once you hit that 160 mark, if you would like, you can sign up as a level 2, pay a $75 fee, and in return, you actually get a deer biologist as well as a forester to come out and do a walkthrough of your property. We provide a management plan, and we help you to get connected to the different resources that may be available to you. And then those same benefits are also available at level 3, and our level 3 is for individuals with 640 acres or more. One thing I want to point out is that even though we have this 160 acre minimum to get a site visit and a management plan, that doesn't have to be your own property. One of the things that we offer is a group cooperative enrollment option. So you can actually come together with your neighbors. So let's say you have 440s, you guys can enroll as a single property into DMAP, and then we would come out and still get all those same benefits. I kind of went over this, but these are just some benefits available to all the levels. We do workshops. We do both in-person and virtual workshops. We have tons of resources as well as a monthly newsletter that comes out. For level 2 and 3, like I said, we do site visits, and that does result in a property management plan that's specific to your property. We also provide harvest reports, and this is really, you guys can put in data and tell us what your harvest is and track your own harvest across time. And in turn, we provide a report that looks at not only what you harvested deer from a deer perspective in your property, but also what the county average was. What did that look like across the state? So you can kind of look across those different scales. We do also offer antlerless tags, so reduced price antlerless tags if your property shows signs of over deer abundance, or if your herd shows signs of deer health issues from overabundance. So we do, like I said, we do have a group cooperative option if you want to reach those level 2 and 3 benefits, but you don't have the acreage yourself. And this is where multiple landowners can come together and enroll as a single property. The only stipulation is that you have to be within a half mile of each other. So each property can be separated by up to a half mile. We do provide a management plan, but it is one management plan for all of the enrolled properties. And another great benefit of this program is that it's a really nice way to kind of build relationships with your neighbors as well as share resources. I kind of whipped through that pretty quick, so sorry if it was information overload. But if you have additional questions, I put my contact information up here. Feel free to get a hold of me, as well as our website to DMAP. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Haley. We do have a couple questions coming up in the Q&A box, and others can feel free to add to those. I'll read one back to you just to start, and while you're kind of thinking about that, I'm going to also launch the poll so that folks can answer if they do want to sign up for continuing education credits, and we'll follow up with those who indicate that they do following the webinar. So one quick, or maybe a quick question to start with, Haley, is what seed mix is recommended for logging trails?
So I can kind of share that back out. I tend to go with the native seed mix. Looking at some of our grasses and forbs, and I try to do a mix of some species that are going to establish really quickly, as well as some that would go out a little bit longer. So I try to get some like Sidot's grandma in there, some bunch grasses in my mixes, as well as some native clovers, and some solidago, some goldenrods, things like that.
Thanks, Haley. And you can probably also look at the Q&A yourself. Another question is, do you have a source that lists that 5 to 10 times higher forage after a forest harvest?
I do, and I can share that out with you afterwards. I can send that source to you, Linnea, if that works.
Yep, that'll
I'm
work
really
fine.
bad at remembering authors off the top of my head.
No problem. We'll get it out to all the attendees.
Yeah.
Another question, and you may or may not know this, Haley, does Michigan have a DMAP type of program that's similar to the Wisconsin DMAP?
I do actually know the answer. So DMAP is available in a lot of the eastern U.S. states. However, it is managed very differently in each state. In a lot of states, it's more of your nuisance tag program or egg damage program than it is a habitat management program. To my knowledge, Wisconsin is the only program where we offer site-specific management and management plans through DMAP.
Oh, I'm glad you knew that answer, Haley. There's another question here in the chat, actually, so I'll read it because it's not in the QA. Is Snapshot Wisconsin only available to large property owners? I have 52 acres and participated in this great program for a period of time.
Yes. To my knowledge, I don't know. I'm gonna say that I don't work directly with Snapshot Wisconsin, and I know their program has changed throughout time. I'm happy to share a link that would provide that. The qualification in our tiered structure that maybe led to that, where if you're a level 3, that that's just priority enrollment, and that's more of a historical artifact from when Snapshot Wisconsin was being was trying to hit certain metrics. And I know I'm not answering that very well, but I can get you the information, I guess, is the short answer.
Yeah, thanks, Haley. We can also send out follow-up notes on these questions to folks. There's a couple of questions that have been answered. Our other panelists have been typing answers in here. But Haley or Pat, our two presenters, perhaps you'd also like to answer. One question is, how would you recommend a landowner attract a logger to conduct a harvest when the land they own is in an area with smaller property sizes? Maybe there's little to no logging industry nearby, and it's difficult to get a logger to be interested in a small or regular sized cut. So just kind of looking for advice or recommendations.
Yeah, one thing that I have found, and Pat, feel free, but is coordinating with other landowners. So if you can get other landowners, they don't even have to be necessarily adjacent, but in the same area, I have found good luck with helping to encourage that way, and to ensure that we're not having high grading then in return. But Pat, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, great answer. The other one too that I know was answered online is that working with NRCS as an example can sometimes, and of course every state's a little bit different, but they may provide cost share to help with some of the whether it's providing some cost share for flagging or in trails, all sorts of things, but to kind of minimize the cost. As you get into some of those smaller jobs, unfortunately, it's hard to attract a logger, or if you get somebody you may be paying actually, and so cost share there may be able to help. The one question that came through, or it was a comment in the chat, and I just want to talk to it because I think it's important. But there was a comment about where I had shared the picture of red pine in kind of that monoculture. And this individual just said, you know, not all red pine looks that way and kind of has a bad rap. And I agree with you to a certain extent. And I think it's good that I clarify, you know, red pine is a native, one of our 3 native species of pine with white pine and jack pine. And it's an important wildlife species, a great seed food source. In the context of how that particular red pine system was planted, it's kind of what I was showing in terms of it being a system that provided very little other habitat benefits because of it being planted in a plantation. But clearly, red pine is a native species. I've got it on my property. I love it. And I think it was a good point that you made. We should love red pine, just like we love our other pines.
Thank you, Pat and Haley. There's one final question. Haley, you may be able to answer this well, and then we'll wrap up for the evening here. I just want to note also, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sharing that recording within about a week. We also have a very brief follow-up survey. We would love to have all of our attendees fill out if you can. It should only take a couple of minutes at most. But our last question for the evening, and thank you again for Haley and Pat for presenting today, is what is the importance of yellow birch for deer and other species?
Yellow birch is a forage, is a preferred forage for white-tailed deer. So that's kind of one of its main.
Yeah, thanks. It sounds also, Dwayne put into the answer, in the typed answer, that it was a species that was more common in the past, but has become a rarer tree species. So any last thoughts there? Otherwise we can kind of wrap up here.
Yeah, I think also here in kind of where I'm at, it's rare, but we'll see, you know, very old yellow pine mixed within kind of old age hemlock systems. And so, you know, unlike paper birch that has a relatively short life, yellow birch can be a very good old growth species and provides a lot of the same kind of benefits that we talked about. You know, there can be cavities, so, you know, supports a lot of insects. So it's a quality tree that, as Dwayne said, it's not as common as what it has been in the past.
Great, thank you both so much. And thank you for all the attendees. That's it for tonight. If you did not receive the link for the last upcoming webinar, which is 2 weeks from now on Thursday evening, March 30th, same time, please send us an email if you need that registration link. And thank you again. Good night.